A new beginning. The soft golden hues of the setting sun bathed the cozy suburban home in warmth as Mike pulled into the driveway. He sighed, feeling the weight of the day's exhaustion pressing against him. His job as a construction manager often left him drained, but tonight he felt something else, a quiet excitement bubbling within. His wife, Molly, had been texting him all day about their newborn son, Connor, and their family dog, Streak. Molly had adopted Streak 2 years ago, when he was just a tiny, shivering puppy abandoned near a gas station. From the moment she picked him up and held him against her chest, she knew he was special. His fur was a striking mix of white and golden brown, and his deep, soulful eyes held a kind of wisdom beyond his years. Mike, initially hesitant about having a dog, had quickly fallen in love with Streak's playful yet protective nature. Now, as new parents, they were adjusting to life with a newborn, and Streak had been nothing short of incredible. But today, Molly had hinted that something extraordinary had happened, something she couldn't put into words. As Mike stepped inside, the aroma of freshly baked cookies welcomed him, mingling with the faint scent of baby powder. Molly stood in the living room, gently rocking Connor in her arms. She looked up and smiled, her blue eyes shining with warmth. "You're home," she whispered, careful not to wake their sleeping baby. Mike kissed her forehead. "Long day, but I'm here now. What's this amazing thing that happened?" Molly chuckled softly, shifting Connor in her arms. "I could tell you, but I think it's better if you see it for yourself." Curious, Mike followed her into the nursery, where a soft nightlight cast a golden glow over the room. Streak lay curled up near Connor's crib, his tail twitching slightly in his sleep. As Molly laid Connor down in the crib, Streak's ears perked up. He lifted his head and gazed at the baby with unwavering focus. Mike raised an eyebrow. "He's been doing this all day." Molly nodded. "Just wait." Connor, still in the haze of sleep, let out a tiny whimper. Within seconds, Streak stood up, his body tense but gentle, as if waiting for a signal. The moment Connor stirred, Streak jumped into action, but not in the way one would expect. With incredible care, the dog climbed onto the plush rug beside the crib, positioning himself close to Connor. Then, as if guided by some invisible instinct, Streak nudged the baby's tiny hand with his nose. Almost immediately, Connor let out a sigh, his fingers curling into Streak's soft fur. Mike's breath caught in his throat. "He's comforting him," Molly whispered, watching the interaction with awe. "Every time Connor gets restless, Streak does that. It's like he knows exactly what he needs." Mike crouched down, watching as Connor's breathing steadied. His tiny chest rose and fell, safe and secure next to his furry guardian. Molly continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Earlier today, Connor wouldn't stop crying. I tried everything. Rocking him, feeding him, singing to him. Nothing worked. Then Streak walked up, licked his tiny fingers, and just lay beside him. Within minutes, Connor calmed down. Mike rubbed his jaw, processing what he was seeing. Streak had always been an intelligent and affectionate dog, but this was something else entirely. Over the next few nights, Mike paid closer attention. Each time Connor stirred, Streak was there before either parent could even reach the crib. When Connor's tiny fists clenched in discomfort, Streak would nuzzle him until his body relaxed. When the baby kicked restlessly, Streak would lie still, allowing Connor to use his warmth as an anchor. And then, one night, something even more remarkable happened. Mike had been up late working on a project in his home office. The baby monitor sat on his desk, filling the room with the occasional soft sounds of Connor's breathing. Suddenly, a strange noise crackled through the speaker, a soft whimper, not from the baby, but from Streak. Mike furrowed his brows. Streak never whimpered like that. Something felt off. He rushed to the nursery, his heart pounding. As he pushed open the door, he froze. Streak stood at the crib, his ears pinned back, his body tense. His gaze was locked onto Connor, who lay completely still. too still. For a terrifying moment, panic surged through Mike's veins. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for his son. Then, Connor took a deep, shaky breath. Relief flooded through Mike, but his hands didn't stop shaking. Had Connor stopped breathing for a moment? Had Streak sensed it? Molly ran in, alerted by the urgency in Mike's voice. "What's going on?" Mike turned to her, still shaken. I think Streak just saved him." They both looked down at their faithful dog, who was still watching Connor with unwavering vigilance. It was as if he knew that something had almost gone terribly wrong. Molly swallowed hard. "Mike, what if Streak wasn't just comforting him? What if he's been protecting him this whole time?" Mike nodded slowly. "I think we need to start paying even more attention." That night, as they lay in bed, neither could sleep. Every little sound on the baby monitor made their hearts race. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, one thing was clear. Streak was more than just their dog. He was their son's guardian. And whatever was happening, it was only the beginning. The silent guardian. The night after Streak's strange yet remarkable behavior, Mike and Molly found themselves more alert than ever. The realization that their loyal dog might have sensed something wrong with Connor left them in awe and concern. What if Streak had saved their son from something they couldn't even perceive? The next morning, as sunlight poured through the bedroom windows, Molly sat on the nursery rocking chair, cradling Connor against her chest. Streak lay at her feet, his amber eyes never leaving the baby. There was something in his gaze, an unwavering watchfulness, a sense of purpose. Mike walked in, a cup of coffee in hand, looking as if he had barely slept. "I can't stop thinking about last night," he admitted. "What if we hadn't been paying attention? What if Streak hadn't been there?" Molly exhaled deeply. "I don't even want to think about it. But I do know one thing. We can't ignore this. Whatever Streak is sensing, it's real." Mike nodded, setting down his coffee. "I'm calling Dr. Hayes today." Dr. Hayes was their family pediatrician, a kind woman with years of experience. If there was something wrong with Connor that they had overlooked, she would know. That afternoon, Molly and Mike took Connor to the clinic. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic, and the soft hum of parents calming their children filled the space. Streak had been left at home, though Mike felt an odd sense of guilt about it, like they were leaving behind the one being who truly understood what was happening. When they were finally called in, Dr. Hayes greeted them with a warm smile. "What brings you in today?" Molly hesitated, then said, "Something happened last night." She explained everything. The way Streak had reacted, how he had seemingly predicted Connor's distress, before either of them even noticed. Dr. Hayes listened intently, nodding as she jotted down notes. "Dogs have incredible instincts," she said. "They can pick up on changes in heart rate, breathing, even subtle shifts in body temperature." Mike leaned forward. "So, are you saying Streak might have sensed something medically wrong?" Dr. Hayes sighed thoughtfully. "It's possible. But let's run some tests just to be sure." Connor, oblivious to the concern swirling around him, cooed happily as Dr. Hayes performed a thorough examination. She checked his heart, his lungs, his reflexes. Everything seemed normal. But then, she frowned. "What is it?" Molly's voice was tight with worry. Dr. Hayes leaned in, listening to Connor's heartbeat again, longer this time. When she finally straightened, she met their eyes with cautious concern. "There's a slight irregularity in his breathing pattern. It's subtle, but it could be something called infant apnea, where a baby's breathing slows or pauses unexpectedly." Molly's heart clenched. "Is it dangerous?" Dr. Hayes hesitated. "In most cases, babies grow out of it, but in rare instances, it can be serious. I'll refer you to a specialist just to be safe." Mike and Molly exchanged anxious glances. Suddenly, everything made sense. Streak had known. He had sensed it before any doctor, before any medical test. When they got home, Streak was waiting by the door, his tail wagging in slow, deliberate movements. The moment Connor was back in Molly's arms, Streak nuzzled the baby's tiny feet, letting out a soft, relieved whimper. Molly knelt down beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" she whispered. "You were trying to tell us all along." Streak licked her hand, his warm gaze meeting hers. That night, they watched Connor even more closely. They took turns staying up, making sure his breathing remained steady. But no matter how much they monitored him, one thing was certain: Streak never left his side. Every time Connor stirred, Streak was there. Every whimper, every restless movement, Streak responded before either parent could. It was as if he had taken it upon himself to be Connor's silent guardian. Then something happened that sent chills down Mike's spine. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Mike, half asleep in the rocking chair, noticed Streak suddenly stiffen. The dog's ears perked up, his entire body going tense. Then he let out a soft but urgent growl, not loud, but just enough to wake Mike fully. Mike sat up straight. "What is it, buddy?" Streak's eyes were locked onto Connor, who lay still in his crib. Too still. Mike's pulse skyrocketed. He rushed to the crib, his hands trembling. Connor's tiny chest wasn't moving. Panic surged through him. "Molly, wake up." Molly bolted upright, her face pale with fear. Without thinking, Mike gently shook Connor, his voice breaking. "Come on, buddy. Breathe for me." For a few terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then, Connor took a deep, shuddering breath. Molly sobbed in relief, clutching her son to her chest. Streak let out a small, whimpering noise and nudged Connor, licking his little fingers. Mike sat down hard, his whole body shaking. "He really did save him," he whispered. "Streak saved his life." From that moment on, neither of them questioned it. Streak wasn't just their pet. He was their son's guardian angel, the bond beyond words. The night after Streak had saved Connor from what could have been a terrifying tragedy, Molly and Mike barely slept. Even though Connor had resumed his peaceful breathing, the reality of what had happened weighed heavily on their minds. Molly sat in the nursery, cradling their baby in her arms, running her fingers gently across his chubby cheeks. He looked so innocent, so unaware of how close he had come to danger. Streak sat beside her, his deep brown eyes locked onto Connor with unwavering devotion. Mike paced the room, his mind racing. "Molly," he finally said, "we need to take this seriously." Streak didn't just act on instinct. He knew. He knew before we did, before the baby monitor even picked up on it. Molly nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know. But what do we do now? We can't just rely on Streak to be our only warning system." Mike exhaled. "I'll call the specialist Dr. Hayes recommended first thing in the morning." Molly glanced down at Streak. "But I also think we need to trust him. He's proven he knows what he's doing." That night, as the house fell silent, Molly and Mike kept an extra close watch. They placed Connor's crib closer to their bed, and though the baby monitor was turned up to the highest volume, it was Streak they trusted most. Days turned into routine. The following days turned into a cautious routine. Every few hours, Mike and Molly checked on Connor, watching his breathing closely. They took turns staying up at night, making sure their son was safe. But no matter how much they watched, Streak always seemed to be one step ahead. If Connor so much as shifted in discomfort, Streak was there. If he let out the faintest whimper, Streak would nuzzle him, calming him almost instantly. It was as if the dog had become a second heartbeat in their home, one that beat in perfect rhythm with Connor's. Mike worked from home as much as possible, unwilling to leave Molly and the baby alone. And when he did have to leave for work, he checked in constantly. "Everything okay?" he texted Molly one afternoon. Molly responded almost immediately, "Connor's good. Streak hasn't left his side." Mike sighed in relief, but something gnawed at him. Could Streak keep this up forever? Could they rely on a dog to be their son's protector when the stakes were so high? A visit to the specialist. The day of their appointment with the pediatric specialist finally arrived. Molly and Mike bundled up Connor, making sure he was warm and comfortable. Streak, sensing the importance of the moment, whined softly as they prepared to leave. "I wish we could take him with us," Molly murmured, scratching behind Streak's ears. Mike smiled. "Me too, but let's see what the doctor says first." The drive to the hospital was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Dr. Patel, a kind, gray-haired man with a gentle smile, welcomed them. "I've reviewed the notes from Dr. Hayes," he said, examining Connor carefully. "Let's run some additional tests to be sure." Over the next 2 hours, they watched anxiously as doctors monitored Connor's heart rate, breathing patterns, and reflexes. He looked peaceful in his sleep, unaware of the medical equipment surrounding him. Finally, Dr. Patel sat them down. His face was calm, but his words carried weight. "Connor does show signs of infant apnea," he explained. "It's mild, but it can be unpredictable. His breathing slows occasionally, and in rare cases, it could lead to long pauses." Molly swallowed hard. "What can we do?" "We'll monitor him closely," Dr. Patel assured them. "In some cases, babies outgrow it as their respiratory system matures. But for now, I recommend using a medical-grade apnea monitor at home. It will alert you if his breathing slows too much." Mike glanced at Molly, their unspoken fears mirrored in each other's eyes. "Would that have helped that night?" Mike asked hesitantly. Dr. Patel sighed. "Possibly, but what you told me about your dog, that's truly remarkable. Some animals have an innate ability to sense distress before humans can. If Streak's been responding to Connor before an episode happens, I wouldn't dismiss that." Molly let out a shaky breath. "So we keep trusting him?" Dr. Patel nodded. "Yes, but now you'll also have the monitor as backup." As they left the hospital, relief mingled with lingering worry. Connor would be monitored, but their faith in Streak had only deepened. A new level of protection. Back home, they set up the apnea monitor near Connor's crib. A small device with sensors gently attached to his foot would track his breathing and sound an alarm if it detected irregularities. That night, Molly and Mike lay in bed, listening to the quiet beeping of the monitor. But despite the advanced technology, it was Streak they watched the most. Hours passed, and then, in the middle of the night, it happened again. Connor stirred slightly in his sleep. Streak, curled up beside the crib, immediately raised his head. His ears perked up, body stiff. Then, Connor's breathing slowed. Before the monitor could even register a problem, Streak was already in motion. He let out a low whimper, then gently nudged Connor's tiny hand. Connor's fingers twitched. Streak whined louder, pressing his warm nose against the baby's arm. And then, Connor took a deep breath, his little chest rising and falling normally again. A second later, the apnea monitor finally caught up, letting out a delayed beep. Mike and Molly were already out of bed, but by the time they reached the crib, Streak had already done his job. Molly let out a shuddering breath. He knew, again. Mike knelt beside Streak, rubbing his head. "You saved him, buddy." Streak wagged his tail lightly, but his eyes remained locked on Connor. At that moment, Mike and Molly understood something profound. Technology had its limits. Science could monitor and detect. But love could sense. Love could protect. And Streak's love for their son went beyond instinct. It was something deeper, something unbreakable. It was a bond beyond words. A guardian's calling. The days following the second incident cemented a truth that Mike and Molly could no longer ignore. Streak wasn't just a family pet. He was Connor's protector, a guardian in the purest sense of the word. The apnea monitor was useful, but it had proven to be slower than Streak. Every time Connor's breathing wavered, the little dog was there before the machine could even register the change. Molly began documenting everything. She kept a journal, noting the times Streak reacted, what he did, and how long before the monitor caught up. It became clear that Streak's responses were more than random. He was sensing something before it even became a full-blown issue. Mike, always the skeptic, found himself staring at Streak one evening, shaking his head. "How does he do it?" he muttered. "How does he know?" Molly, seated beside him with Connor in her arms, smiled softly. "Maybe it's not about knowing. Maybe it's about feeling." Streak, lying on the floor beside the crib, lifted his head as if he understood the conversation. His deep brown eyes locked onto Mike's, unwavering, certain. Mike exhaled. "Then we need to make sure he's trained for this." Molly raised an eyebrow. "Trained? I mean it," Mike said. "If he's already doing this instinctively, imagine what he could do with actual medical detection training." The idea sparked something in Molly. "You're right," she said. "What if we could sharpen his abilities? What if we could help him help Connor?" The next morning, while Connor napped peacefully, they did their research. They found programs dedicated to training dogs to detect medical conditions, seizures, diabetes, even breathing irregularities. Most of these dogs were specifically chosen from birth and trained for years, but Streak had already shown a natural ability. That had to count for something. They reached out to a nearby trainer who specialized in medical alert dogs. After a long conversation, the trainer agreed to evaluate Streak. A week later, they arrived at the training center, a modest facility run by a woman named Jenna Carter. She had been working with service dogs for over 15 years, and the moment she met Streak, she seemed intrigued. "So, tell me," she said, kneeling in front of Streak and letting him sniff her hand. "What makes you think he has what it takes?" Mike and Molly explained everything. The nights he had sensed Connor's distress, the way he responded before the apnea monitor, his unwavering devotion. Jenna nodded thoughtfully. "That's impressive and unusual." She looked at Streak. "Would you be willing to let me test him?" Molly hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Absolutely." Jenna led them into a training room with a controlled environment. She explained that she would use scent samples from other infants with similar breathing irregularities to see if Streak reacted. The test was simple. Several blankets were laid out, each carrying a different scent. Some were from healthy infants, while others held traces of the same irregularities that caused apnea episodes. The moment Streak entered the room, his nose twitched. He sniffed the air, his body tensing. Molly held her breath. Streak ignored most of the blankets until he reached one specific cloth near the far end of the room. He sniffed it, then whined softly. Jenna watched with raised eyebrows. "Interesting," she murmured. Streak nudged the blanket, then looked back at Mike and Molly, letting out a small bark. Molly covered her mouth. "That's exactly how he reacts to Connor." Jenna nodded slowly. "I'm going to run another test." This time, she introduced a live simulation. One of her assistants carried a doll programmed to mimic irregular breathing patterns. The moment the simulation began, Streak's ears perked up. He stood completely still, watching. Then, as soon as the baby in the simulation showed signs of distress, Streak moved forward, nudging the doll just as he did with Connor. Mike exhaled sharply. "It's real. He's really detecting it." Jenna looked at them seriously. "This is remarkable," she said. "I've trained dozens of medical alert dogs, and what your dog is doing, that's pure instinct. Most dogs take months, even years, to learn this. But Streak, he already knows." Molly wiped a tear from her eye. "So, what does that mean?" Jenna smiled. "It means he's special, and it means I want to train him formally." Over the next few weeks, Streak underwent structured training. Though he had already demonstrated his natural ability, the training refined his skills. He learned to recognize even smaller changes, alert in specific ways, and signal distress even if Molly and Mike weren't watching. It was during one of these training sessions that Jenna pulled Mike and Molly aside. "There's something you need to know," she said. "Dogs like Streak. They don't come around often. His bond with Connor is beyond what I've seen in most trained medical dogs." Mike frowned. What do you mean? Jenna hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I mean, he isn't just reacting to scent. He's reacting to Connor himself. Molly's breath hitched, like a deeper connection. Jenna nodded. Exactly. Some dogs bond so closely with their humans that they develop an almost telepathic-like awareness. It's rare. And Streak has it. The realization sent shivers down Molly's spine. That night, as they returned home, Streak immediately went to Connor's crib. He curled up beside it, his warm brown eyes watching over the sleeping baby. Molly knelt beside him. You really are his guardian angel, aren't you? She whispered. Streak wagged his tail, pressing his head into her palm. Mike watched from the doorway. We're lucky to have him, he murmured. Molly smiled, brushing her fingers over Connor's tiny hand. No, she said softly. Connor is lucky to have him. As the days turned into weeks, Streak's training continued. But one thing never changed, his devotion to Connor. And then, one fateful night, everything Streak had learned would be put to the ultimate test. A night that would define his purpose forever. The night of the silent cry. The house was unusually still that evening. Molly had just put Connor to bed after a long day of training with Streak. The little dog had progressed immensely under Jenna's guidance, but his instincts had always been sharper than any technique they taught him. Mike had finished some late-night work and was in the living room, flipping through a book, while Molly curled up in bed, exhausted. The new medical-grade apnea monitor was plugged in and ready, its small screen blinking reassuringly. Everything felt calm. But Streak knew better. Something wasn't right. Even before Molly and Mike drifted into sleep, Streak was restless. He had been lying beside Connor's crib like always, but tonight, an unease settled into his small frame. He paced the nursery, ears twitching at every sound. His instincts were screaming at him. Something was coming. But he didn't know what. At exactly 2:37 a.m., it happened. Connor, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly stopped moving. His chest, which should have been rising and falling with each breath, remained unnaturally still. There was no sound, no cry, no gasping, just silence. The apnea monitor failed to detect it immediately. Streak, however, knew. His head shot up, eyes locked onto the crib. His body went rigid, every muscle coiled with urgency. He leaped up, pressing his nose to Connor's tiny hand, willing him to move. Nothing. The baby's skin was warm, but his body was eerily motionless. A sharp panic gripped Streak's tiny frame. He whined, licked Connor's fingers, and nudged his chest harder. Still nothing. Streak's heart pounded. He didn't have time to wait for the monitor to catch up. He did the only thing he could. He barked, a sharp, piercing bark that shattered the silence. The sound ricocheted through the house like a gunshot. Mike bolted upright in bed. Molly, disoriented, barely had time to register what was happening before Streak barked again, louder, more frantic. Then, the monitor finally caught up. A deafening beep, beep, beep filled the room. Mike and Molly were already running before their minds could even process the sound. Molly reached the crib first, her hands trembling. Connor. Her voice broke as she scooped him up. His tiny body was limp in her arms. Mike grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. Our baby isn't breathing, he choked out. Molly, fighting the panic flooding her chest, remembered everything the doctors had told her. She tilted Connor's head slightly, checked his airway, and began stimulating him. Rubbing his back, speaking his name, doing everything in her power to get him to respond. Come on, baby, she whispered desperately. Come back to us. Streak stood beside her, whining loudly, his eyes filled with distress. And then, Connor stirred. A small, weak breath escaped his lips. Molly gasped. Mike. He's breathing. Mike barely heard the 911 operator telling him an ambulance was on the way. He fell to his knees beside Molly, pressing his forehead against hers as tears welled in his eyes. Connor let out a soft cry, his little chest moving again. It was weak, but it was there. Streak let out a relieved whimper and licked Connor's tiny fingers. Molly clutched her baby against her chest, tears streaming down her face. "You saved him," she whispered, looking at Streak. The paramedics arrived within minutes. By then, Connor was stable, though still weak. He was taken to the hospital for observation, where doctors confirmed that he had suffered another apnea episode, one that could have been fatal had Streak not intervened. The doctors were stunned when they heard what had happened. "Your dog woke you up before the monitor?" one of them asked in disbelief. Mike nodded. "Not just before. Way before." The lead doctor shook his head, clearly moved. "That's incredible. I've heard of service dogs detecting seizures and diabetic episodes, but this is something else entirely." Molly held Connor close, looking at Streak, who sat loyally by her feet. "He's not just a service dog," she said softly. "He's family." That night, as they returned home from the hospital, Molly and Mike knew that life would never be the same. They had seen a miracle unfold before their eyes, and the miracle had 4 legs and a wagging tail, a hero's legacy. The events of that fateful night changed everything. What had once been just a sweet, playful dog had now become something far greater. Connor's guardian, his protector, and the reason he was alive. Molly and Mike knew they owed Streak more than just their gratitude. They owed him a purpose, a recognition, and a life filled with love for what he had done. A community in awe. Word of Streak's heroic act spread like wildfire. It started with the doctors and nurses who had witnessed Connor's miraculous recovery. They couldn't stop talking about how Streak had responded before the apnea monitor, how a family pet had outperformed medical technology in sensing the danger. Then Jenna, Streak's trainer, shared his story within her network of service dog specialists. Soon, organizations that specialized in medical alert dogs reached out, expressing their amazement. Some even wanted to study Streak's natural instincts to learn how other dogs might be trained in similar ways. Local news stations picked up the story next. A headline flashed across TV screens and online articles. "Hero dog saves infant's life before technology could." Neighbors stopped by, bringing treats and toys for Streak. Complete strangers reached out, offering donations to ensure he got the best care and training available. The most emotional moment, however, came when a mother from a nearby town visited them. She held her own baby, a child who also struggled with sleep apnea. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Streak, sitting faithfully by Connor's crib. "I don't have the words," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your story gave me hope." Molly hugged her, both women understanding a bond deeper than words. Honoring a true hero. A month later, Mike and Molly were invited to a prestigious award ceremony for heroic animals. Streak was to be honored alongside military dogs, police canines, and other life-saving service animals. Dressed in their best, they'd brought Connor, who was now stronger, healthier, and full of life, to the event. Streak trotted beside them, his tail wagging, oblivious to the grand stage awaiting him. When the announcer called Streak's name, the audience erupted in applause. Molly stepped forward, holding Connor, while Streak sat obediently at her feet. "This little dog," Molly began, her voice thick with emotion, "did something that no machine, no doctor, and no technology could do. He sensed my son was in danger before any alarm sounded. He saved his life. And in doing so, he gave us hope." Mike knelt down and placed a hand on Streak's head. "Heroes don't always wear capes," he said. "Sometimes they have fur and 4 paws." The standing ovation that followed was deafening. As Streak received his medal, a small golden emblem shaped like a paw print, Molly whispered in his ear, "You've always been our hero." A new purpose. After the ceremony, an idea took root. What if Streak's story could help others? Molly and Mike decided to partner with Jenna to create a program aimed at training family pets who showed natural medical alert abilities. Not every dog had Streak's instincts, but many had the potential. If Streak could save Connor, maybe other dogs could save other children too. The initiative grew beyond what they had ever imagined. Families reached out from across the country, hoping their own pets might have a hidden gift waiting to be discovered. Streak became a symbol of hope, not just for their family, but for many. And through it all, he never changed. He still curled up beside Connor every night. He still watched over him with unwavering devotion. Connor grew, strong and happy, his bond with Streak unbreakable. And as the years passed, whenever Molly looked at Streak resting peacefully beside her son, she knew. Some heroes come into our lives not to be discovered, but because they were meant to find us all along.